Hey guys, what's going on? I'm John Malecki, and in this video, I'm going to show you how I build reclaimed furniture. So for almost all builds, you want to start with a cut list. Here I'm ripping down some rough stock, and I mean this stuff is rough. I pull it right off the pile you can see behind the table saw, and start chopping it down to rough lengths. Now keep in mind that none of this stuff is dimensioned. I have took hours to flatten and surface all of these pieces, so that way I had an inventory of rough sawn reclaimed wood that was down to something close to 3/4 of an inch by 4 to 6 inches in width. So just like any type of wood, you want to surface it on the joiner first, that being making one side flat and then squaring a second side to the flat side. I then go through the planer and make a third side parallel, and using the planer I get it as close as I can to 3/4 of an inch, and then I rip the fourth side on the table saw to make the board square on 4 sides. After that, it's over to the clamps. Here I'm using some parallel clamps by Jet, and I'm making panels, and this project has like a dozen panels in it, so it was a lot of repetitive glue ups. But since I had this all stocked out and built pre-assembly, I was able to make most of the panels beforehand. Now when you have nice square boards, you don't need dominoes, you don't need biscuits. The glue is plenty strong enough to hold everything together, so I don't use any in this. Also, the variations in reclaimed wood don't really allow to use something to align with, so I just use glue and clamps, and I take my time and make sure that I'm getting everything as flat as possible before the glue up. I can go back after and flatten things a little bit better with my Rotex, which you'll see here in a few steps. While the panels are in glue up, I head over to the chop saw and I start dimensioning out the bigger timber, I guess you could say. This is the stuff that'll be used on the legs and the stretchers, and that'll hold all the panels together. Same process, joiner, 2 sides. Here you can see I'll flip it over and I'll get a square edge, and then I will rip it on the table saw and run it through the planer to get it to the thickness that I'm looking for. In this instance, I'm looking for 1.5 inch thick material, so it's just a matter of running it through the planer and the table saw. And you can see there that this part of the process when using reclaimed wood just takes a long time, but if you do it right, it really sets up for a speedy assembly. This is a lot of repetition, but you can see all you got to do is get your stuff dimensioned down to the widths and lengths that you like, and if you do it all beforehand, it makes for an easy assembly process. Here I'm over at the miter saw station, and I'm cutting down my rails and stiles to length, and then I'm assembling my face frame. Here is just using some spacers to make sure everything's the same width and distances apart. I then mark everything to use dominoes. If I could go back and change anything in this project, I would have just used integral tenons on everything, because after the dominoes made it a little bit tricky, and after this you'll see I routed grooves and everything for all of the panels, and it kind of became a pain when it came to the assembly process. But you live and learn. So here you can see how I'm laying out, marking everything, just making sure all those joints are tight. I mark them all with a specific number or letter, or whatever it is for my reference, and then I'll start putting dominoes and everything. So here I'm using my Festool Domino XL. This tool is amazing. It really helps build better projects using floating tenon joinery. It's an expensive tool, but it's very well made, and I'll have this for the rest of my career in woodworking. That being said, it does add a little bit of a learning curve with the tool itself. Here I have a reference plate on the bottom of the domino that makes sure everything is lined up where I want it. I'm using all of the tick marks that I put on the wood in the previous scene where I was laying it out to reference and slot all my dominoes. Now I'm using the pin guide system on the Domino XL, and that is where I'm referencing all of the side tenons in the sides of these vertical posts or rails or whatever you want to call them. Here, the tool's amazing. Like, there's barely any dust, super fast. So after I have the face frame laid out, it's over to the router table. I'm running slot dados in all of the rails and stiles that'll have panels. The back, the front, and the bottom will all be floating panels, so I'm running 1/4 inch dados in all of those parts that will coincide with the panel. Here we had to get a little fancy and do some stop joinery. So essentially I put a tick mark on the fence, I run the piece over the bit and stop. And that's about it. Use the plunge cut. Now that the panels are all dry, I rough cut them down on the table saw. And you can do this on the table saw or on your chop saw or with the track saw. There's a lot of ways to do this, but I get them down to the sizes that I'm looking for. And then it's over to flattening. The rough wood, the reclaimed wood, has a lot of variation, and even if you do get it all milled down to 3/4 of an inch, it's really difficult to make things flat. So the Festool Rotex is a great tool for this, and I just crank out the rest of the panels, flattening those up and getting them as smooth as I can before assembly. It's much easier to sand these flat before you put the whole thing together than it is to try to get in all those corners once you have it assembled. So in this angle you can see I cut all the corners off of the panels, and this makes for an easier assembly when you have those floating tenons and all of those stop dados, you could call them, in the rails and stiles. Because of those, you run into having to square each corner with a chisel or cut the corners off the panels. I just prefer to cut the corners off the panels because it is way faster than trying to chisel out all of those corners by hand. Moving on from there, I pre-finish the side panels in all of the door fronts, and I pre-finish anything I have to that'll be moving. So all these parts are going to have some movement in them over time, and if you don't pre-finish them, you'll get a reveal of where the stain was on the panel over time, and no one wants to see that in a nice high-end piece of furniture. So pre-stain all these bad boys, and then I go over to the assembly of the carcass. So just like the face frame, I go through the process of assembling the side panels first. Here you can see the panels that'll be inserted. I'm using Titebond 2 and some dominoes. The whole process is pretty smooth here if you did your layout correctly and you're prepped. I'm just making sure the glue gets really deep down into all of the mortises. Because it's reclaimed wood, it does suck it up pretty quickly. So make sure you have plenty of glue in there. I'm not a huge advocate for glue squeeze out galore. A lot of people want to see squeeze out everywhere, but as long as you get a nice little bead when you clamp everything up, you know you did a good enough job of putting glue in the joint. So I have maybe a 1/16 of an inch clearance on all sides of these panels, and that's very slim. A lot of people don't use this type of joinery because of the movement in the wood. Having a solid state panel on the side would probably work better, but I wanted a specific look for this project, and the inside of the carcass is completely wide open. So because of that, I used floating panels on the outsides. Here I'm pre-finishing the back. Same process as before. I flattened these all out with the Rotex. If you have a belt sander, that works as well. If you have a drum sander, another great tool, that would work perfect here. Just making sure that I'm staining any panel that might have a reveal down the line before I install it. So moving on to assembling the rest of the carcass, the sides are dry, and here I'm just doing the same process. A lot of glue on the dominoes inside their mortise, and it'll come together pretty quickly after this. I just do the back because I don't have extremely long clamps, and this piece is 60 inches wide. So I'll use pipe clamps that I can screw together and get this to stay nice and square. I'll use a stretcher from the face frame to have the top alignment, and now you'll see that in a second here. For glue ups like this, it's nice to have a rubber mallet, and you can bang your piece around kind of without marring it. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just getting everything square using the marks that I put on the piece in layout. Here's that stretcher I told you about that helps keep everything nice and square. After it dries, I move on to the face frame and the bottom assembly. Same process as before, a lot of glue, making sure it's getting nice and deep in all the mortises and dominoes. That becomes a little bit redundant in this video, but you can see the importance of taking your time during a glue up when it comes to making a nice, sturdy, and stable piece. Here's the top rail, and it goes right back to where it was in the previous part of the glue up because I used that stretcher for spacing earlier. Getting a little fancy with the camera work here. You can see a top-down view. I have the bottom panels floating down there, and now I'm just joining the rest of the face. I have a through tenon on the top and the bottom parts for the face frame, and I slide those through, and I'm gluing those in here. And then you'll see it just is a matter of making sure that I put glue in all the slots and holes and get all of the parts in the positions of where they're supposed to be, and that comes back to having a good layout. So matching all those marks and numbers and letters and everything that I was using there. Alright, so now that everything's in place, it's back to clamps. Here it comes in handy to be a large, tall man like myself. Reaching over the box was a little bit difficult, but I'm putting everything together with the long pipe clamp, so you can see I have a collet in the center there that helps me get that length. And then I'll use the deep throat on the parallel clamps to pull all of the tops and bottoms together. And it does make for some really nice, strong joinery, and it stayed pretty damn square too. So that's going to conclude part 1 of this video. Stick around for part 2 to see how I do all the doors and drawers.